Hi, I'm Victor Perton. I'm the Chief Optimism Officer of the Centre for Optimism, and we're holding this in partnership with VicWater, which is the organisation that represents all of the water utilities in Victoria, as well as several of the catchment management authorities. I'm deeply honoured to be accompanied here by two of Australia's great leaders. Pat McCafferty, who is the CEO of Yarra Valley Water, is a global leader in the utility sector. He's in demand, speaking at global conferences. He was the head of WASA, which represented again the water utilities. So Pat McCafferty, thank you for making yourself available today and welcome.
Thank you, Victor, and I'm blushing.
Well, I've probably understated the qualities of your leadership. And then Rob Masters, who is the chairman of the Centre for Optimism, one of Australia's great leadership and strategy experts, and it's a privilege to serve under him. I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous people. We're on many lands. We'd like to acknowledge their stewardship of the land and the waters which we use, and obviously to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. And to the people of many other cultures who are joining us here today. I know that we've got people joining us from India and even from the United States today. So a welcome to people from all cultures. So Pat, you couldn't get away with a visit to the Centre for Optimism without being asked what makes you optimistic. So may I ask you what makes you optimistic personally, and what makes you optimistic that you can resolve the issues of our water supply for the next 50 years?
Thanks, Victor. Look, I think I'll start with the latter question first. What makes me optimistic about the next 50 years is the work that's being done by a lot of really good people, dedicated people from across the metropolitan water sector to plan for an uncertain future. The way they've come together, the expertise that they've brought to the table, and the thinking that we've got. And it's all backed up by a very robust planning framework that we have here in Victoria for our water supply planning. So that absolutely makes me optimistic. In terms of a personal approach to optimism, I've always been a glass half full person. I mean, they say optimists live longer, but I always do think that ultimately humans find a way, and I always get inspired by the people that I work with. So that'd be my answer to that question.
That's brilliant, Pat. One of the things that Harvard University has just published last week is the extent to which optimism is the underpinning of longevity, no matter what culture, what gender, although they do find that women live to 90 and men to 85. So not completely equal on that front. So look, strategy, most people have trouble coming to grips with a strategy for 5 years, much less 50 years. Can I throw to you, Rob, to ask Pat about this strategy and how it's being done?
Yes, thanks very much, Victor. Pat, I found it fascinating just reading the summary and some of the longer detail as well. But to get the water authorities together was a major task, no doubt, in the first place. So how did you go about collaboration, and then the overview as far as the long term, as you say, 50, and as Victor said, many people have trouble planning tomorrow, let alone 50 years ahead, in what you just said earlier, in an uncertain future?
Sure thing, Rob. Well, I think the first thing is that each of the individual water utilities, as per the framework, the planning framework, is required to do an urban water strategy. The previous iterations were done individually, but I think it's fair to say that there's a collective mindset that the challenges that we face require a different approach. And when we were coming up to this 5-year planning horizon, so we have to do these urban water strategies every 5 years. It was absolutely a no-brainer for us to come together. And I think there's been, a shift, I guess, in collaboration, the commitment to collaboration as well. And just last week, we had a joint workshop between Melbourne Water, South East Water, Greater Western Water, Barwon Water, and and Yarra Valley Water, talking about the need for us to be powerful together and how we come together on these things. So, you know, rather than doing these things individually, it just made a lot of sense. You know, with the same impacts, the same challenges, you know, broadly the same customer, customer set. So we went about it by basically creating an independent project team, which reports to the general managers, strategy general managers from across the businesses, and then into the managing directors. And we've been catching up, you know, every month on the project. So we put a project director in, and Madeleine Greenlee, I think, might be joining us today. So people were seconded in from the different water businesses to form this joint team. So I think I'd hope the team would say that they've been given sufficient resources, enough clarity and guidance from the leadership from across the water sector to do their task. I think the draft document that delivered so far, I think is testament to that. So that's how we went about it. And of course, then the team has a mixture of different expertise. Clearly, you know, we need people who are great at communication, people who are great at planning, you know, the technical aspects, you know, demand management, forecasting, all of those sorts of things. So it's all come together really well.
Mm. I noticed you've virtually used in the summary an IAP2 model, which is on collaboration and engagement and that. So how did you get the voice of the people, and particularly traditional owners, into that strategy? Because you make reference to them in a number of areas.
Yeah, that's true, Rob. And I should also acknowledge that I'm standing on Wurrung land, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And, you know, I do say that, you know, this urban water strategy, I think for the first time, really, you know, had the ambition to have traditional owner voices front and centre, and be in partnership with TOs on the whole water plan. And I think, you know, the team has done a really good job of engaging. So we have different traditional owner groups that are affected by this plan. So engaging all of those groups and in a very respectful way, you know, listening powerfully to their concerns and their aspirations as well, and putting that front and centre of the strategy. So, you know, that's been really important, very compelling, and combining that with a deliberative approach. Obviously, you know, due to the pandemic, we've had to do a lot of this online, but it has also enabled us to hear from voices that we might not always hear from, because of the flexibility that online you know, delivers. So deliberative approaches as well, with various community members, as well as expert panels as well. So it's been a real combination of you know, consultation from, you know, different voices, and probably taken it to a whole nother level this time around.
Yeah, and you talked earlier about an uncertain future. We know climate change is an uncertain future, because I was looking at the average rainfalls, and in Northern Australia, the average is over the last 20 years is above, but in Southeast Australia, it's below the averages. So that's one factor, but also the use of water, I assume, was a big factor in what you're doing. So can you just highlight or go into those two areas, especially climate change and the use of?
Yeah, climate change obviously is a significant impact on you know, water sector and communities. If we look at just the metropolitan story here in Melbourne, you know, we've had something like a 30% reduction in stream flow into our catchments over the last 30 years. If you combine that with the fact that 2 million more people live in Melbourne now, and we're projecting to double through to 2070, which is the, you know, the time horizon for this strategy, you know, that has a significant impact on where we get our water from. The other thing that we really need to note is that you know, cities are getting hotter as well, hotter and drier, and the livability, you know, the well-being of the human beings, you know, is severely compromised by, you know, extreme heat. So that's another consideration that we need to think about as well. And then I guess the third element around water use, it's really pleasing that, you know, since the Millennium Drought, we've had a significant reduction in water use per capita. Here in Melbourne, 33% lower than the late 1990s, which is significant. Mm-hmm. So you might recall during the drought, we had a target 155. We still have that target, and you know, we've come down from something like 247 litres per person per day to currently at about 163. So we're not far off that 155 target. And when that 155 target was set, it was actually set commensurate with what we thought water use or water savings would be under a stage 4, which is the most extreme water restrictions. So we've managed to, take a lot of ground, and that's through obviously appliance efficiency, behaviour change, and also, we are seeing the stock of houses, shift as well. Smaller properties, less gardens, and so forth. So it's a whole combination. This plan is targeting continued water efficiency. I will say though that I think it can't be the only answer when you think about the future that we're facing. We've taken a lot of the juice out of what's available, but we'll keep going with water efficiency because it's still probably the most cost-effective, environmentally friendly strategy you can have because it also saves energy. And it's very, much embedded now in the community's mindset. Every time we do community engagement, it's the very first thing people go to.
Yeah, and when you said the use of water and the households are dropping from that point of view, who are the major users of the Melbourne water?
Yeah, it's shifted a fair bit, Rob. I mean, even if I just think of Yarra Valley Water, I mean, some of our major customers initially when I came here were places like Ford and Wholeproof. And of course, we've seen, some of that manufacturing, decline. The big users of water, and I must say, this is the other thing that most people don't realise, 70% of the water use in Melbourne is residential. So by far outstrips any other water use. But the bigger water users now are organisations like universities and councils. People have a lot of open space. There are still large water users here in Melbourne, and we've got a couple of big ones in our patch, Visi and CSL, but it's not as much as it used to be.
Yeah, and I also noticed that you've used the term manufactured water, and I cast my mind back to a number of years when I worked with Engie on the desal plant being constructed, and the controversy that created at the time, and the arguments about do we need it or not from that perspective. But in your strategy, you're talking about manufactured water. So can you just elaborate a little bit on how you see manufactured water? What makes it up, and what percentages are from the components?
Sure thing, Rob. Yeah, well, so, it's manufactured water is really code for desalinated water, more recycled water use and stormwater reuse as well. It's fair to say that when the desal plant was first commissioned and envisaged, I guess it was probably thought more of an insurance policy and a top-up approach for our storages. It's also now fair to say that because of the impacts of population growth and climate change, it's fast transitioning into part of our baseload of our supply and being considered that way. So if you think about our current storages at the moment that are around mid 80%, about over 20% of that is actually from desal water. So contrary to popular belief, we have been using the desal plant every year for the last 5 or 6 years with some significant water orders. This year's order is very modest because we've had a couple of really good years in terms of stream flow. But we would be around the low 60% now without that desal top up. And we know that in extreme conditions, and certainly in 2008, when we had that total collapse of our inflows into our catchments, you can go down by 20% in 1 year. If you go down from 60 to 40 really quickly, and then you get another back-to-back event, you're really scrambling. So that's why it's been important to keep the storages topped up. Going forward, really, again, because we can't rely, or the climate is uncertain. So we will get heavy rainfall in the future as well, but we don't know when and we don't know how much. But it's also, fairly certain that, we will also get more droughts and more extreme droughts, and that's happening all around the world, and certainly in Australia and the southeast for sure. But even in California, recently they've announced water restrictions for over 6 million Californians in Southern California, whereby I think they're only allowed to water once a week. Now that's pretty extreme. They've had the last 20 years have been the 2 driest decades on record, and they're really scrambling. So we don't want to be in that position. I think one of the great things about this framework and this strategy, Rob, is that we're planning 50 years ahead. And I think the community can take a lot of confidence from that. I mean, if you have the distinction recently about what's been happening with energy and the uncertainty around, being able to supply reliable energy, in the midst of winter, I think, we can take a lot of confidence that we have these frameworks and we are doing planning, looking out 50 years. So getting back to the manufactured water, I mean, obviously desal is part of our future because it's climate independent, and so is recycled water. And so recycled water is a pretty significant part of our strategy as well. I mean, I know all of the water utilities are implementing recycled water projects in their areas. I mean, recently for Southeast Water, there was a major recycled water initiative announced, taking water out of the Eastern Treatment Plant for about, I think, something like 46 businesses in that area, in conjunction with the local councils, and some government funding helping out with that. So that's going to supply market gardens, nurseries, golf courses, and so forth. For Yarra Valley Water, we've mandated recycled water for 100,000 homes in the growth corridor in the north of Melbourne. We've already got about 37,000 homes being supplied with recycled water there. We're working on a project to supply 6,000 properties at Doncaster Hill, which is an infill redevelopment with recycled water. And of course, there's a lot of work being done on stormwater reuse as well, right across Melbourne. We've had these integrated water management forums, which have been facilitated by the government. And, they're looking for all of the opportunities for how we can reuse water that, is already there in the environment. And we know, for instance, Rob, if you develop, a greenfield, land development, you can get up to a 5 times increase in the volume of water that's produced because of hard surfaces and the fact that human beings are generating sewage and so forth. So, yeah, it's all part of the mix.
Yeah. I can't let you go without asking one more question, and that your positioning of it, Water for Life, which I thought was a very interesting statement to make and a very important statement, but also Melbourne Water. In all my years, have prided itself on being the quality water of Australia, if not the world, from many perspectives. How do you see the quality of the water in your plan coming forward?
Well, I mean, it's always the first priority. So clearly, safety is number one, and then of course, pleasant tasting, odorless and so forth. And I know, most Melburnians are very proud of what we've got in terms of our water, our drinking water. It's great, and especially when you travel, people are always reminded of the quality of the water that we have here. And I have to say that we are so privileged as a consequence of past planning decisions. And I guess what we're thinking about now with this 50-year strategy is what are we leaving behind, and what's the legacy for future generations? Because the people who set aside protected catchments for Melbourne, that's a jewel in the crown, so very little treatment required. It's not filtered. This is the majority of the water doesn't have to be filtered, and it comes from those rainforests and so forth. So that is just a fantastic legacy that those predecessors have provided us. So we know that we want to sustain that reputation for high quality drinking water. All of the water that comes back into the system from alternative sources, particularly desal, there's a lot of work done to make sure that is a match for the prevailing water quality that most people enjoy.
Yeah, and my just last question, Victor. I was reading the Sydney University outlook on water, and they had 5 major points, and a number of the ones you touched on with climate change and things like that, as far as and the quality of water. But they're also talking about the actual data collection. In strategic planning, data is a foundation on what you're making a lot of the decisions. So how do you go about the data element in your planning?
Yeah, there's several aspects to that, Rob. Obviously, utilising central points of data around things like population growth, and the effects of climate change scenarios in relation to what might happen to stream flow and so forth. There's also the data collection around end use. So across the sector, we do a lot of end use studies to look at what's happening in the profile of water consumption. What's the uptake in water efficient appliances? Are there behaviours that are changing, and so forth. So there's many data points We use we really rely heavily on some of the, very capable technical people at Melbourne Water who do a lot of the scenario planning around climate change and so forth. So, as I said, many data points and many people involved.
Good, thank you very much. Victor, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you very much for that, Pat.
We've got some great questions coming online. One of the questions that people have got, Pat, is around recycled water. And there's a good question from Ben there, which is curious to hear how we can go about gaining the social license to incorporate more recycled potable water versus desalination. As we know, there's been failures in Queensland, and the Singaporean government tends to be quite secretive about the mix of recycled versus fresh water. So how do we go about getting a social license from the community to use potable recycled water?
Well, I think the first answer to that question, Victor, is that there's only two types of water in my book: water approved for drinking and water that isn't. All water sort of goes around, if you like. As far as I know, there's not any more water than when the planet was first created. So, look, I think the community has a strong pull for recycled water. There's no doubt. Certainly for outdoor uses and flushing toilets. I mean, this is why we want to do the Doncaster Hill project. We've got a lot of multi-story buildings and apartments going in, and it's a shame if we weren't able to sort of at least flush those toilets with recycled water rather than perfectly good drinking water. And we have seen a shift occurring in very dry areas. San Diego, Perth, for instance, both starting to shandy recycled water into their aquifers, and then to bring that back into the system. It's not policy here in Victoria. I think it's a very long discussion that has to take place with all of the key stakeholders, and people having confidence about the technology and those sorts of things. But the great thing about, what we've got is that we are a bit spoilt for choice in terms of our options. We are by the sea, we can access desal water. We have a lot of choices. The focus really with recycled water is about, and stormwater for that matter, is about doing as many opportunistic projects as we can with those that continue to buy us time, that pushes out the need for a next major augmentation, which is likely to be desal.
So there's a question from an anonymous attendee, and having read the report, I know you've got the answer to this question at your fingertips, and certainly Madeleine, who's online's got it. With the 50-year scenario planning, what does the worst case scenario look like?
Well, the worst case scenario would be in the realm of, doubling the population and a significant reduction in stream flow. I think Maddie might correct me, but I think it's between a 50 to 70% possibility in the reduction in stream flow into our catchments. And of course, if you're doubling the population, notwithstanding the fact that you'll get a benefit of water efficiency going through all that time, you're almost starting to look at a doubling of water supply that's required. But that's no different to what we've been through in the past, Victor, as a growing city. Melbourne's had its growing pains in the past and has had to increase its water production accordingly. And that's the same all around the world for growing cities, people moving into urban areas and so forth. So the worst case would be more than a doubling of population, and also an even more severe sort of stream flow. I see Maddie's jumped in there, so Maddie, if you want to maybe add to that.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Madeleine Greenlee. I'm the project director of Water for Life, the strategy that Pat is doing a wonderful job giving you an overview of today. And Pat, I think you've touched on the key bits there, kind of what's your worst case scenario when we're looking at the challenge we face in Melbourne in terms of our future water supply. And the key that we've done through this piece is trying to quantify kind of what that means at different points in time. So you want to look at, when we look at scenario planning, we're looking at your low, medium, and high possible projections across your climate change scenarios, as well as your population growth scenarios, to get that sense of supply and demand and how they interact. So Pat's spot on with that doubling population growth projection. That's a really key one. And that range of possible impacts of climate change. What we do as Water Corps is want to make sure that under that the high demand, high climate change scenario, we can still deliver high quality water. So part of that safe and secure sustainable water supply is then saying, okay, if we're looking at that high scenario across all the different projections we have, what does that look like at key points in time? So where we've gotten to in the strategy, and if you're able to have a flick through, you'll see that supply demand graph is one of the key cornerstones of how we define the challenge. So at 2030, you look at kind of that deficit between what supply do we have, what demand do we have, what's the gap in between. And so at 2030, you're looking at about 85 gigaliters of water, up to about 600 gigaliters by 2070. And then you start thinking, okay, so you've got this range of kind of possible scenarios. So that's your worst case. And we want to plan for that. But we also have to think about how you manage that uncertainty moving forward. And so I'd expect Pat is going to get into the kind of a cornerstone adaptive plan within the strategy next. And that'll talk to kind of how you manage some of that uncertainty in that worst case.
So we've got another question here from Stuart. And Stuart says, he talks about the water energy nexus, which, you know, when we talk about California, for instance, and the water that's pushed from North California to Southern California, you know, there's a huge energy cost. So the way Stuart's rephrased it, with the increasing dependence of both water production, including manufactured and stormwater, and transfer on electricity, what are the forecasts for the cost of water with the rapid increase in electricity costs? And Pat, you've got a huge team devoted to producing a price submission at the moment to the Essential Services Commission. So what's the increased price of power going to do to energy costs? And you might like to also just do a bit of a shout out to Yarra Valley Water's zero net carbon ambitions.
Thanks, Victor. Yeah, look, it's a tricky question to answer because it depends on the timing and the nature of whatever those major augmentations are. I mean, yes, they are energy intensive. I think one of the great features of the existing supply is that it actually is low energy by comparison because we don't filter and we don't have to do as much pumping because it's a gravity fed system. So we've got a nice natural system in place, and also requirements through the government. Certainly Rob will remember this, that the first desal plant that's been built down at Wonthaggi is required to be 100% offset in terms of renewables. We are all working hard on our programs to reduce greenhouse gases, the efficiency of how we use energy. Victor talked about some of the things that we're doing. We're targeting to go beyond net zero in 2025, primarily through a combination of solar and joint solar projects as well across the Victorian water sector, and organic waste to energy and so forth. We haven't factored in yet what might happen to water prices in an explicit way because we are very uncertain about the timing of what we need, and that's why. Going back to Maddie's point about an adaptive plan, and that's the beauty of doing this way is that, as I said before, the more we can do at the moment in water efficiency, the more we can do in alternative water projects, the more time we buy, and eventually, the more time you buy, eventually it does rain again, and then you have a bit of a buffer. So what we're trying to do is not get into a point where we have to scramble for new supplies. That's why utilising current desal plants is important. I know I haven't answered the question directly because it's one of those ones which will depend on the nature of what we end up going with. What I will say though is that the average water bill in Melbourne is amongst the lowest in the country. In fact, it's been the lowest for a long time. Sydney's catching up. And so we've got a bit more work to do to sort of maintain our leadership position. And also that when it comes to water, we understand it's a universal human right. Clean water and sanitation, reliable and affordable. And so that, whole lowest community cost approach to what we do is really foremost in the way we think about this. and making sure that no one, in terms of their capacity to pay their bill, no one will ever have their access to those essential services compromised. So I can't be direct and specific in answering your question, but I hope that gives you a little bit more insight into the way we approach it.
So there's a couple more questions, but before we get to that, I mean, you and I recently went up to Sylvan, and the water feeds into the system. Maybe for those who don't know, can you in fact just talk a little bit about that simplicity that's there, that we do, unlike California and unlike, European cities, we don't spend a lot of money pumping it. So, the water gets into Sylvan and the other catchments. How does it get to the household?
Through a very significant network of major distribution assets, including pipelines and treatment plants and tanks, storage reservoirs, all scattered all throughout Melbourne. I'm actually standing in Mitcham here. We're right next to Mitcham Reservoir. So if you want to know where all the high points are in Melbourne, you find out where the storage reservoirs are. But it's if you think about Sylvan, for instance, one of the things that we were sort of talking to the Melbourne water folks about was, just how little, the treatment process, is required there. Just a little bit of chlorine, being added, and a very natural, as I said, a very natural system because of the gravity. Melbourne actually, and certainly in the east of Melbourne, we have some of the highest water pressures in the world, which is, because of the natural system that we have. So, look, it's been a well-planned, series of assets that have gone in to support a growing Melbourne, going way back, over 120 years. We still have assets that are that old, that service the people, the community as well. And we're in a constant, and all of us at the moment are working on our price submissions, but we're in a constant state of analysing what needs to be renewed and updated, and what needs to be added to as well. And the thing about water and sanitation for the community is most people don't get to see it, right? It's highly valuable in terms of what it does, but it's underground or it's behind trees and up on the hills and so forth. But there's billions and billions and billions of dollars of assets that service the community.
Well, there's an anonymous question, which actually picks that up. How much water do we have? I guess you could even do a picture of what it looks like. So if a drought commenced next month, unlikely given the weather forecast, but let's say within the next few months, how many years do we have before a day zero situation? Is there enough time to build the next major augmentation project?
Yes, I'd be confident that there is. We're doing a lot of readiness activities. Part of this draft plan is actually to do readiness activities. So, we're already looking at what, the alternative projects might be, starting to unpack those. What are they going to look like in terms of timing, effort and cost? We're in a good position at the moment because of the buffer that we do have in our storages. Even without any rain at all, we've got, a fair amount of water in the catchments. I think probably more, at least probably a year and a half, maybe 2 years worth of water, just in storage. In fact, if I have a quick look here, I think we've got 1,500 gigalitres of water currently in store, and we use 400 to 460 roughly gigalitres a year in Melbourne. So it's 3 years worth of water in store, which is a great buffer. And of course, it will rain at some point. It's just a question of being prepared for the worst case scenarios.
So a question probably both to you and Madeleine, again, anonymous one. Do you think the strategy is sufficiently transparent? In other jurisdictions, much of the underlying details are presented in the strategy document, or even sometimes in the release of supporting technical reports. Could more information be released to the community?
Yeah, well, I might start off and then pass over to Maddie on that. I think, I think that there's a sort of a tricky nuance to these things as well, because, really what we're wanting to do is have conversations with the community, expose what their concerns are, what their values are, what their aspirations are, and then, come up with a, sort of portfolio of responses to that and get feedback on that. I think that there, sometimes can be a pull also to, really look under the hood. And I think, the water sector is, committed to transparency as well. Those who are, ultimately very interested in the detail. I don't think that there's anything really to hide here. But, Maddie, have you got any comments to make on that?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. And obviously there's a lot of technical work. And as we've flagged from the beginning, this has been such a huge collaborative piece across 4 metropolitan water corporations, working with the Department of Environment, working with the community, traditional owners, industry experts. So there's a lot of work that's gone on behind the scenes. But as we even put up, kind of that adaptive plan as one of our key cornerstones, we included so much information in the strategy. And I'll flag the strategy is close to 200 pages. So we're not shy of information out there in the public realm. But what we put forward was kind of, what are all the options we looked at? How did we go from that long list of options to a short list of options? Which options evaluation criteria did we use that the community developed, the traditional owner groups developed? All of that is really transparently put forward in the strategy. So you can see how we walked through that thought process, how we came into the adaptive plan that is then there in chapter 4, I believe, of the strategy. And even with that adaptive plan, you look at it and you see, gee, there are all of these different pathways. There are all of these different ways to respond to that future uncertainty in climate change projections and population projections. And so even then, it's, as Pat said, kind of starting to distill out the best way to get feedback on it is to pull out some of those key messages that say, gee, looking at that, you see we need a lot of water and there's no silver bullet here, right? We need kind of all of these options to come together into a diverse portfolio of solutions. So how do we do that? What steps can we take now to make sure that we're ready? And does this sound like the right approach? And so that's really the point of this draft strategy consultation, is to kind of pull out some of those key messages, because when you get into the many documents of kind of how did we get to there, we want that piece to be transparent. We want feedback on, is this the right approach for the next 50 years? So it's a fine balance, as Pat said, but I think everything you're interested in is in the document.
Fantastic. So look, there's 2 questions that really run together here. One from Mark, which is terrific to hear about the engagement of traditional owners in the development of the strategy. What consideration and commitment was there around returning water to traditional owners? And then thinking about that consultation, there's another question about engagement with the Birrarung Council.
Maddie, you want to have a crack at that?
Sure, happy to. So in working with traditional owners on the development of the strategy, as Pat flagged earlier, it was one of our key priorities from the very beginning, both to be a very community-led and in partnership with traditional owners approach. And so across the greater Melbourne region, across the 4 water corporation regions, we've got 6 registered Aboriginal parties that we worked with predominantly through this process. And we were really fortunate in that the Central and Gippsland region sustainable water strategy, which is another key piece the department has been developing, they had started up a traditional owner partnership that already had quite a bit of momentum as we came into our strategy development process. So we were in a really fortunate position coming into this, that we were starting to have some of these really tough conversations around, how do we return water to traditional owners in principle, in policy direction? That's where the sustainable water strategy is headed. We as water corporations, we need to follow that policy directive. And how do we do that? What is the tangible outcome of how you actually start to deliver that? How do we bring the community along on that journey as well? And so we had a great opportunity to bring traditional owner groups in to speak to our deliberative community panel, for example, and have that conversation of, this is what's important to us. These are our cultural values. Here's how we see that played out over a 50-year frame. And so that's been a really important piece for us. And, I think in short, it's not an easy answer. We don't necessarily have 100% clarity at this point in time on how much water is going to go where, when, but we're all very committed to working on it. Pat's been involved in quite a bit in the sustainable water strategy space and how we progress that. And we've got another timeline here until the end of 2023, I believe, is the first action, first cab off the rank in the SWIS delivery plan to put forward proposals, and in partnership with our traditional owner groups that we're working with on how we're going to do that and which projects will contribute?
And I think it's very consistent with where the state's going with truth telling and treaty processes as well, and recognising that water is a fundamental part of traditional owner values and care for country and those things. So I think that there's a sort of a restorative sort of thinking that's being applied. But it's work in progress, that's for sure.
So picking up that restorative, and as you know, I've just finished the United Nations Staff College course on circular economy. So, Yarra Valley, we talk a lot about regenerative and restorative. And there's a great question here from Nathan. I blame Nathan for the reason I wear these orange spectacles, which are circular economy spectacles. Nathan asks, we already have some amazing pilot projects happening in the circular economy space. Does the 50-year plan also incorporate more circular economy opportunities that can be built into our planning and thinking?
Yeah, well, certainly I think it's fair to say that when we think about, the alternative water, integrated water management projects, they are very much circular in nature, by nature, I should say. So, certainly stormwater, and there's been some really good projects on stormwater reuse recently, and, looking after local waterways, restoring them. If we can take, if we can reduce flooding, the impacts of those on natural waterways, and also whatever goes into those, waterways as well, as part of that by, scooping up stormwater and treating it for reuse and other, other uses. That's all part of, bringing the environment back. And, really interesting project recently. I think Melbourne Water and Greater Western Water involved, up at Mooney Ponds to, start to restore a natural waterway there. And, the interesting thing about legacies is there's been some brilliant legacies for water in Melbourne, as I said before, but maybe some of the legacies like concreting every waterway we could get our hands on probably isn't a great legacy in retrospect, because it's sort of, it means that, we're trying to rush the water away, but the water has a role in the natural environment. So, yeah, I think that's part of it, Nathan.
Pat, I was just wondering with the, you mentioned the desal plant, and we've got 10 catchment areas for Melbourne. Have we got sufficient capacity to look at the 70-year scenario in those, or are you looking at other scenarios where we need more catchments?
Certainly, that hasn't been on the agenda, Rob, to, extend our, extend our demand, if you like, on the natural environment and to go for, other water sources elsewhere. It's not really on the agenda. It really is, fundamental to this plan and to the future is that, keeping rivers healthy and, not taking more water. And in fact, realising that, we need to substitute for our own consumptive needs. We need to substitute water with manufactured water and, not rely on the rivers as we have in the past.
Good.
So we've got, so I had a question via Twitter today from someone who's a policy advocate, and she was asking me about infrastructure, present and future, and the impact of climate. And of course, it's been a big part of the price submission. How much is maintenance going to cost? How much do we need to test? How much do we need to use predictive analysis? So there's a good question from Nathan, a different Nathan. To keep the unit cost of water as low as practicable over the next 50 years, what is the best approach to minimise the total whole of life asset management costs of the physical infrastructure? So I've invited all these people to come online, but they're all a bit shy about having their images on screen. So that's why I'm reading them rather than inviting them on screen.
To keep the unit cost of water as low as practical, what is the best approach to minimise the total whole of life asset management costs of the physical infrastructure? I think the answer to that question is that, we do take a whole of life perspective of our assets. It really is about sweating them to the extent that we can, It is about timing. You don't always get it right, but it does get down to sort of the modelling that we use. I think if we take a lowest community cost perspective, we tend to lift ourselves up a little bit from the direct accounting to look at the externality costs and benefits as well. And I think that's something that, that we'll be doing more and more going forward with all of these projects. I mean, even if you think about integrated water management, we know that cities are getting hotter. We know that health is being impacted. I mean, there's some work done on the third city for Sydney, I think, recently, by Frontier Economics that could see significant human health benefits. I mean, it's getting so hot and dry out in that area. We become unlivable in the future without a cooler, greener environment that's enabled by reusing water in the environment, more stormwater reuse and recycled water and so forth. So, we know that there's a massive health benefit there, but the direct costs are higher because you're building more infrastructure. So I think that there's ways to go. It's a conversation that's been happening right across the water sector, both here in Victoria and nationally, about how we look at these costs and benefits in a very different way, but still take, what's the lowest community cost outcome or mindset to these things.
So we've got one final question, which is a good one. So this is a draft strategy we're talking about. So anyone who's got more interest, so maybe Maddie, one of your team can just put the URL into the chat again, but it's certainly on our website and the like. So this is a draft strategy. Everyone who's watching either live or on demand, you are encouraged. There's a questionnaire, a really well-guided questionnaire to participating in this. But the question then to you, Pat, and to Maddie is, could you briefly explain what the preferred strategy is, if there is one?
I would say the preferred strategy is to get all the low-hanging fruit we can. Certainly, number one is still pursuing water efficiency, because, as I said, it's lower cost generally, and it's better for the environment. You're taking less, you're being smart with your water use, you're using less energy. Followed by, more and more integrated water management projects and being opportunistic about those. Certainly the examples I talked about before, some of them are infill, where something significant is happening, in terms of urban redevelopment. We take that opportunity to look at all sources of water in that particular development and reuse it. Greenfield to plan for more alternative water projects right up front. One of the things that we're really keen on as a sector is integrating infrastructure planning more with land use planning, so that very early water has a seat at the table and is considered early, so that we don't lose those early opportunities to integrate water into the environment and reuse it. And so those projects, some of them are at scale, some of them are small, but every bit helps, right? They, as I said, buy us more time. And then ultimately, it is more manufactured water at a large scale. That's sort of inevitable, really, which is at this stage desalination. But buying time, being adaptive, making the most of what we've got, optimizing. The other really interesting thing is that we've got a grid now, which was built on the back of the Millennium Drought. And that grid is another fantastic asset for Melbourne and the state, because it means that we can move water around to where it's most needed as well. And that's a big asset that we've got that we didn't have before. So that's strategy in a nutshell, I would say. Maddie, you have anything to add?
I think for anyone interested in getting a little bit more kind of tangible, what are the options that we're taking forward? What's that key core of the plan? The adaptive plan in the strategy does a really nice job of unpacking those elements that Pat just spoke to, in terms of, while we need that diverse portfolio of solutions, and just from hearing Pat, it's a broad remit of actions that we're taking forward, right? But the adaptive plan gives you a pretty quick snapshot of how we're combining those three key categories of water efficiency and conservation, integrated water management solutions, and those manufactured water options or supply system augmentations. And I think one of the key pieces that it recommends, and one of the key phrases we've used a lot throughout, is that piece around investing in readiness. And so a part of this strategy is really recognizing that we have high water storages today it puts us in a very fortunate and opportunistic place to forward plan so that we can have that range of fit for purpose options needed when ready. And by being proactive, doing some of the preparatory works and all of these different options, investing heavily in those IWM and water efficiency options as well, it puts you in a place to think about how you stagger that required financial investment over time and think about how we keep prices affordable for customers over that 50-year time frame. So it's about how it all comes together and how we keep all of our ducks in a row over the next short term.
I think that was a beautiful way to end. We're nearly up to the hour, and we've had a very engaged audience both here and on Facebook and elsewhere. Asked me to share. I'm sorry, no, it's just a commentary there that I'll delete from the video. We'll be sharing this video, so if you've got teenage children or children or companions in their 20s, give them this opportunity to participate in the consultation document, because I'll be 113 at the end of this strategic period. So those who are in their teenage years and in their 20s, I reckon it's a great opportunity for them. So Robert Masters, look, thank you for joining in. You are one of the established national leaders on both leadership and strategy. So it's been a privilege to have you here. Madeleine, as I've said to you so many times, I'm so impressed with what you and your team have managed to do on this. I just think it's utterly impressive. And then you, Pat, I will not flatter you and get you to blush again, but I've spent years working with you now, and you are one of the great Australian leaders, and I say that without reservation. And what you and the other leaders of the water companies have done in confidently collaborating with putting together, a merged team with all sorts of skills, from engineering to futurology and the like, I think has been absolutely superb. So on behalf of the community and on behalf of all the people attending today, can I thank you, Pat, thank you, Madeleine, and to all of the team that is online. Anything that you want to leave us with, Pat, Madeleine and Robert?
I would just say I want to really acknowledge Maddie's leadership and the team that's been, compiled from across the water sector. They've done a tremendous job, and we're really proud and grateful.
Yeah,
Thank you all.
I'd endorse that, Victor. I think planning for 50 plus years or more is a marvellous initiative, and it does give, as you just said, Victor, the future generation an opportunity to participate and see where their future lies. So well done to both you, Maddie, and to Pat and the teams behind you. Thank you.
And Maddie, the last word goes to you.
Well, and Victor, I think for the theme of optimism, what makes me optimistic is strategies like this and being able to be involved in these types of discussions. It's exciting stuff. We're really pleased to have a draft strategy out for public consultation now for a 5-week period.
Maddie, one of my favourite things when I draft a strategy is to be able to do strategy on a page. So even though the document is 200 pages, there is a fantastic whole of the strategy on a page. So it's not too complicated for anyone. So thanks, guys. Thanks to everyone who joined us, and we look forward to meeting you again in the near future.
Thank you, Victor.
Thanks, Victor.
Well done. Thanks, Victor. Thanks a lot, Rob. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Pat. Bye.